Saul tried to control the message of Christ by silencing it. He traveled to Damascus under the authority of the high priest, with permission to go into the synagogues there and find anyone who believed in Jesus, and he had permission to arrest them and take them back to Jerusalem and put them in jail. Now, have you ever wondered why the followers of Jesus would have shown up at the synagogue? Now, there was one temple, and that was in Jerusalem. The temple was where all the faithful Jews would go, and they would take their sacrifices to make their offerings, to make their sacrifices before God. But in local communities, there were synagogues. In some ways, the synagogues might compare to local churches today in various communities. But in the synagogue, it was not so much a place of worship, but the synagogue was a place where the law was taught. The law was explained. The Old Testament scriptures were explained, and so people could understand what it is that God wanted for them, and also teaching them about the word of the prophets. And so it would have been in the synagogues that faithful Jews had been taught about this Messiah who was going to come. And so those who had encountered Jesus, those who believed in Jesus, they would naturally go back to the synagogue and say, "We've seen the Messiah. We've put our faith in Him," and they would try to convince others to follow Jesus. And what happened as they went into the synagogues, there often was a divide. There were those who would believe in Jesus, and there were also those who would reject Him. And so there were conflicts in the synagogues. As you read on about Paul's missionary journeys, whenever he went into a new community, often where he went first was to the synagogue. And he went to the synagogue in order that he could tell the faithful Jewish believers there about the Messiah who had come. Now, often as he arrived in a new community, they were open to hearing about this Jesus, but the longer he was there, the more divided the synagogues would be, and eventually he would be kicked out in most communities. And so the synagogue was the natural place to go and talk about this Messiah who had come. But because all didn't embrace Him, it also became a point of conflict in the synagogues. And so, as the Apostle Paul as Saul is going to the synagogues, he's trying to find those who believe in Jesus, with the intent of taking them and putting them in jail. Saul believed that what he was doing was right. He believed that it was his responsibility to silence those who believed in Jesus. And if they could silence the message, then this stuff about a Messiah would go away. But in the midst of Saul's zeal, Jesus got his attention. There was a light from heaven that shone around him. And when I read this story, I always think about kind of those cop shows that they're showing a chase at night, and they got a helicopter in the air that's got a spotlight and is following someone, and you can watch the person that they're after. Well, the thing is, this wasn't at night. It's in the middle of the day, and it says that a bright light, a light that would have been brighter than the sun, shone down and was a spotlight right there on Saul. We're told that he was knocked to the ground. He heard a voice that said, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Now, when the Apostle Paul tells the story of his conversion to King Agrippa, as it's recorded in Acts chapter 25 and 26, he says, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Why do you kick against the goads?" Now, I believe it's very descriptive of the control that Saul is trying to take. Now, for anyone that's ever been on a farm and tried to move livestock, whenever you're going to move livestock, you generally have a prod, a stick, something in your hand that most of the time you can just use that stick, and it kind of gently guides them in the direction that they're to go. Occasionally you get a stubborn one that wants to do their own thing, and Jesus is describing Saul as someone who is being stubborn. He says, I'm guiding you. I'm using the prod to kind of goad you in the right direction. but you're not paying any attention to my goad, and actually what you're doing is you're fighting against it. Now, if you've got a stick that you're kind of poking a cow trying to get it to move forward, and it kicks at you, it kicks at the goad, actually what happens is it ends up hurting itself worse. You may have been doing a gentle prod, but as it kicks, that goad may hurt as it digs into the muscle. And that's what Jesus is saying Saul is doing. He said, I've given you some gentle prodding. I've given you some direction, but you're kicking against the goad and you're just making things worse. Well, what was Saul kicking against? First of all, Saul had religion, but he didn't have a relationship. He knew a lot about God, and he was zealous to tell others what he knew about God, but he didn't have a relationship. He didn't have a personal relationship with God. It was only a mind game for him. When I was in college, I took a class that was entitled The Bible as a Piece of Literature. I was going to a state college, and so it was not the Bible, and it was not a biblical studies class, but it was viewing the Bible as a piece of literature. And the professor, even though he was given to the study of the Bible, he was always very critical. He was always making fun of it. He was always belittling it. And I could never figure out why a PhD, a professor in literature, would want to even study the Bible if all he wanted to do was ridicule it. But it was a mind game for him. He was critical of the Bible, but he never really believed anything that it had to say. That would describe Saul. He had a head knowledge of who God was, but he really knew very little about God from first-hand experience. He was kicking against God's prodding in his life. The second reason that Saul is kicking against the goad is because he's doing God's business, but he doesn't know God's will. Think about it. Saul was zealous about defending his faith, but it was his own faith. It wasn't a faith in which he really knew what God's will was all about. Because Saul was so stubborn, it took this major encounter with God to get his attention. Now, if you were to ask Saul who it was that he was persecuting, he would have probably told you he was persecuting the Christians. He would have probably told you it's those who believe in Jesus that he was arresting, and those are the people that he was persecuting. But as Saul is knocked to the ground, Jesus said, I am the one you are persecuting. When we do not respond to God's promptings in our life through the power of the Holy Spirit, then it's as if we are persecuting or hurting Jesus. And I think so often we think that when we don't respond to God's guidance, when we don't respond to God's prodding in our life, we say, I'm just hurting myself. But as we look at this passage, what Jesus says to Saul is that I am the one that you are persecuting. When we don't respond to God's promptings in our life, when we don't respond to the guidance of the Holy Spirit, then it's as if we are persecuting or hurting Jesus.